When the courier handed me the package signed by my husband's secretary, I expected corporate paperwork. Instead, I found a vintage music box. As the twisted melody of You Are My Sunshine played, my blood ran cold. It was the exact song from a violent home invasion I survived in my 20s, a trauma I had only ever whispered to my husband. Standing there 7 months pregnant with our second child, my grief instantly calcified into absolute rage. Hello to our wonderful audience at Violet Revenge Stories. Sadly, YouTube has disabled our monetization, leaving us without the budget to keep operating, but we still want to bring you the best stories. If you enjoy today's episode, please consider supporting us with just $1 so we can pay our hardworking team to survive and keep creating for you. You can do this by scanning the QR code on the screen or clicking the donation link in the description or comments below. My name is Olivia Rivera, and the day my marriage ended, the Seattle rain was falling in a steady, rhythmic drum against the bay windows of our immaculate home. I opened the heavy oak front door expecting a grocery delivery, but instead found a courier standing on the porch. He handed me a square package wrapped in thick, unbranded brown paper. The delivery slip taped to the top was signed by Chloe Sterling, the executive secretary at my husband's firm, Aegis Vanguard Holdings. I brought the package into the kitchen, placing it on the cold marble island. At 7 months pregnant with our second child, my lower back ached with a dull, constant pressure, but I ignored it. I reached for a paring knife and sliced through the heavy tape. Inside, nestled within layers of black velvet, was a vintage, customized music box. Its wood was dark, polished to a mirror finish, and completely devoid of a maker's mark. I turned the small brass crank on the side, once, twice, 3 times. As the internal gears engaged, a distorted minor key melody began to chime into the quiet kitchen. It was You Are My Sunshine. The air in my lungs immediately turned to ice. The kitchen, the marble countertops, the steady rain outside, everything vanished. I was no longer a 35-year-old expectant mother standing in a multi-million-dollar estate. I was 22 again, tied to a wooden chair in a cheap apartment, bleeding from a gash above my eye, while 2 men tore through my belongings. During that agonizing 2-hour home invasion, a television in the next room had been left on, playing a children's program. That exact cheerful tune had looped over and over, searing itself into the deepest, darkest corridors of my mind. It was a horrific trigger. It was a nightmare I had locked away and shared with only one person on this entire planet. My husband, Julian Vance. I stared at the music box as the chilling notes continued to ping against the silence of the room. The realization did not crash into me like a wave. It seeped into my bones like a slow-acting poison. Julian had not merely betrayed me. He had weaponized my deepest, most sacred trauma. He had handed the darkest night of my life to his mistress and allowed her to package it up and mail it to his pregnant wife. Psychologists often say there are 5 stages of grief. I bypassed all of them. The sorrow that should have shattered me instantly crystallized into absolute, unyielding rage. It was a cold, clinical fury that sharpened my vision and slowed my racing heart. I did not shed a single tear. I did not scream, and I did not throw the music box against the wall. Instead, I carefully closed the lid, cutting off the twisted melody. I walked over to the kitchen desk and opened my laptop. My hands were perfectly steady. I logged into my pharmacy account and silently canceled my monthly prenatal vitamin subscription. I did not need anything nurturing in my system. I needed to be hollow, sharp, and ready for war. Next, I opened my medical portal and booked a clinical appointment for a full stress evaluation, laying the groundwork for a heavily documented medical paper trail of my physical state. Finally, I picked up my phone, bypassed the usual contacts, and sent a brief, encrypted text message to Eleanor Hayes, known simply as the most ruthless divorce litigator in Washington state. The message contained only 3 words: I am ready. 10 minutes later, the screen of my phone illuminated with Julian's caller ID. I took a slow, deep breath. smoothing a hand over my swollen abdomen, and answered, "Olivia, you would not believe the utter incompetence I am dealing with today." Julian barked into the receiver, his voice thick with the arrogant exhaustion he always brought home. He launched into a tirade about a junior analyst mismanaging a portfolio, fully expecting my usual subservience. He expected the soft, supportive wife who would murmur sympathetic platitudes and ask what she could prepare for his dinner. I listened to him breathe, picturing him sitting in his corner office, completely unaware that the ground beneath his empire was about to crumble. A slow, genuine smile spread across my face, reflecting in the dark glass of the kitchen window. "Julian," I interrupted, my voice smooth, light, and perfectly even. "What?" he snapped, annoyed at being cut off. "I agree to a divorce," I said. There was a dead, heavy silence on the other end of the line. He had not asked for a divorce. He had not even hinted at leaving his comfortable, double life. "What are you talking about?" he finally stammered, the authoritative edge completely gone from his tone. I did not explain. I simply pressed the red button on the screen, terminating the call, and placed the phone face down on the marble counter. When the heavy mahogany door swung open at exactly 7:30 in the evening, Julian stepped into a house that defied every rule he had ever established. He expected the immaculate staging of a model home, accompanied by the aroma of a slow-roasted dinner. Instead, he was met with the chaotic sprawl of unwashed laundry draped over the designer leather armchairs and 5 brown paper grocery bags sitting heavily on the hardwood floor, their frozen contents melting and pooling into dark, damp circles. I sat perfectly still on the center cushion of the living room sofa, my legs crossed, casually sipping a glass of lime sparkling water. The silence in the room was thick and heavy, pressing against the walls like a physical weight. "Olivia, what on earth is going on here?" Julian demanded, his voice dropping into that low, authoritative register he reserved for reprimanding insubordinate employees. He dropped his leather briefcase onto the foyer table with a loud thud. "I had a miserable day at the office. We had that bizarre phone call where you spouted absolute nonsense, and now I come home to a house that looks like a war zone. Are you having some kind of episode?" I took another slow sip of my water, letting the carbonation burn the back of my throat. "I suppose I lost track of time," I replied, my tone flat, carefully devoid of any defensive edge. He sighed, a long, exaggerated sound meant to convey the immense burden of dealing with my supposed fragility. He walked over, stepping gingerly around a pile of folded cashmere sweaters that had cascaded onto the rug, and stopped right in front of me. He reached into his suit pocket and pulled out a small, rectangular box. "Look, I know your hormones are completely out of balance right now," Julian said, his voice dripping with weaponized sympathy. "The pregnancy is making you erratic. I snapped earlier, and I apologize. I brought you something to make up for it." He tossed the box onto my lap. I did not need to open it to know what was inside, but I played my part. I lifted the lid. Tucked beneath thin tissue paper was a cheap, silk blend scarf, dyed in the exact navy blue and silver color scheme of Aegis Vanguard Holdings. The corporate logo was subtly woven into the hem. It was the standard, leftover promotional material his human resources department handed out to interns at the end of the 3rd quarter. He was handing me a piece of corporate debris to placate the woman he was actively destroying. "It is lovely," I murmured, staring blindly at the ugly fabric. "Thank you, Julian. Just get some rest. Olivia, I will order us some takeout," he said, already turning away, completely satisfied that his meager offering had subdued his hysterical wife. Just as he walked into the kitchen, my phone vibrated against the glass coffee table. The screen lit up with a notification from an unsaved number. I knew immediately it was Chloe. I unlocked the screen. It was a high-resolution photograph. In the center of the frame stood my 7-year-old son, Leo, bundled in a bright red snowsuit, grinning brightly against the blinding white backdrop of a ski resort in Aspen. Flanking him were Julian's sister, Beatrice, and Chloe herself, both wearing matching designer ski gear, Chloe had her arm draped casually over my son's shoulder, projecting the sickening image of a perfectly happy, wealthy family on a winter holiday. Beneath the photo was a text message that read, "So sorry. Meant to send this to Julian. Leo is having a wonderful time. Do not worry about him." My grip on the phone tightened until my knuckles turned stark white. A month ago, Julian and Beatrice had cornered me in the dining room, insisting that the high altitude and the stress of travel would be far too dangerous for my condition. They had convinced me to stay behind in Seattle, assuring me that Leo needed bonding time with his aunt. Staring at the screen, the true depth of their conspiracy snapped into sharp focus. Julian was not just replacing me in his bed with a younger, more compliant subordinate. He and his elitist, sneering family were actively, methodically erasing me from my own son's life. They were conditioning Leo to accept Chloe, folding her into their aristocratic inner circle, while isolating me in this massive, empty house. I did not reply to the message. I simply locked the phone and slid it into my pocket, letting the ice in my veins freeze over completely. Hours later, the house plunged into darkness. The digital clock on the bedside table read 2 a.m. Beside me, Julian was deep in a heavy, arrogant sleep, his breathing loud and rhythmic. I slipped out from under the duvet, my bare feet making absolutely no sound against the plush carpet. I walked around to his side of the bed. His primary smartphone and his secured work tablet sat charging on the nightstand. Aegis Vanguard Holdings required military-grade biometric locks for all executive devices. Julian believed his data was impenetrable. He forgot that a sleeping man has no defenses. I carefully lifted his right hand, guiding his limp thumb to the sensor of his phone. The screen flashed green and unlocked instantly. I repeated the process with the tablet, then carried both devices into the master bathroom, shutting the heavy door and plunging myself into absolute darkness, save for the blue glow of the screens. Sitting on the cold tile floor, I connected his devices to a hidden, encrypted application I had installed on my own network. My fingers flew across the virtual keyboards. I bypassed his secondary authentication by accessing his linked email, a trick I had learned years ago when he asked me to organize his digital calendars. Within minutes, I began quietly downloading a staggering volume of data to an untraceable offshore cloud server I had purchased under a shell corporation. I pulled 7 years of joint financial records. I extracted hidden offshore banking statements he had deliberately omitted from our tax filings. I downloaded thousands of encrypted emails between him, Chloe, and his board of directors. I watched the progress bar inch forward, each percentage point transferring another piece of his ruined empire into my hands. 10%, 40%, 80%, 100%. When the transfer was complete, I wiped any trace of the connection from his devices, crept back into the bedroom, and placed them precisely where he had left them. I slipped back under the covers and stared at the ceiling until the sun came up. I would continue to play the broken, depressed, incapable housewife. I would let him feel utterly and completely in control, never realizing that the woman lying next to him had just finished arming the proverbial warhead. The grand ballroom of the Fairmont Olympic Hotel dripped with the kind of aggressive, suffocating wealth that made the air feel dangerously thin. Crystal chandeliers the size of small cars hung from the vaulted ceilings, casting a fractured, icy glow over the attendees. Julian had mandated my presence 3 days prior, delivering the instruction not as a request, but as a corporate directive. Aegis Vanguard Holdings was 48 hours away from closing a $300 million merger, and the optics had to be flawless. I was to play the role of the devoted, heavily pregnant matriarch, providing the necessary illusion of a deeply rooted, stable American family. He had even hired a private stylist to force me into a restrictive, emerald green silk maternity gown that dug painfully into my ribs. I stood near the perimeter of the room, holding a glass of sparkling cider, watching the city elite gorge themselves on imported caviar and exchange hollow, calculated pleasantries. The atmosphere was a suffocating theater of fake smiles and ruthless ambition. I navigated toward the far corner of the room, seeking a fleeting moment of quiet near a massive, intricately carved swan eye sculpture that was slowly weeping freezing water into a silver basin. My solitude lasted less than 1 minute. Beatrice Vance materialized from the glittering crowd, clutching a crystal flute of vintage champagne. She wore a severe, high-necked black gown that perfectly matched the sharpness of her angular features. She looked me up and down, her lips curling into a familiar, aristocratic sneer. "You look absolutely exhausted," Beatrice remarked, her voice a poisonous purr disguised as genuine concern. "Julian tells me you have been struggling to keep up with even the most basic household duties. Really, it is a terrible shame your modest, working-class upbringing never properly prepared you for the grueling demands of our world." I took a slow, measured breath, keeping my expression perfectly blank. Beatrice took a delicate sip of her champagne and leaned closer, the overwhelming scent of expensive floral perfume and alcohol washing over me. "We are currently looking into the Wellington Academy for Leo," she whispered, her eyes gleaming with unfiltered malice. "It is a brilliant, highly disciplined boarding school in Switzerland. Julian agrees that the boy desperately needs structure and a refined environment. He certainly cannot remain under the influence of a hysterical, emotionally unstable mother. We will ensure he gets the proper Vance upbringing, thousands of miles away from your endless neuroses." Before I could even formulate a response to her threat, a sudden ripple of hushed whispers swept through the crowded ballroom. I turned my head, following the collective, captivated gaze of the wealthy investors and corporate board members. Chloe Sterling was gliding down the grand marble staircase, pausing deliberately at the landing to ensure every single eye in the room was fixed upon her. My breath caught in my throat, not from any lingering sorrow, but from the sheer, unadulterated audacity of her wardrobe choice. She was not wearing a typical gala gown. She was wearing a custom silk and lace dress with a plunging neckline and a dramatic, sweeping train. It was an exact, deliberate, line-for-line replica of the gown I had worn on my wedding day 8 years ago. Julian had to have given her the designer original sketches from his private safe. Chloe easily found my face in the massive crowd. Across the sea of dark tuxedos and glittering diamonds, she offered me a slow, victorious smirk. She genuinely believed she had won the war. She believed she was watching a broken, defeated woman helplessly witness her own replacement. A polished brass bell chimed loudly, signaling the beginning of the evening formal presentation. The guests eagerly gathered around the main stage, where a massive digital projector screen displayed the golden Aegis Vanguard logo. Julian stepped up to the mahogany podium, confidently adjusting his silk tie, absolutely basking in the rapt attention of his peers and the men who were about to hand him hundreds of millions of dollars. "Ladies and gentlemen," Julian began, his voice booming through the state-of-the-art sound system, dripping with practiced, magnetic charisma. "Tonight, we are not just celebrating a highly profitable merger, we are celebrating the core, unshakable foundation of Aegis Vanguard: integrity, trust, the unyielding commitment to family values. We build our corporate partnerships on the exact same principles we use to build our homes: total honesty and unwavering loyalty." As he continued his sickeningly hypocritical monologue, I quietly slipped my phone out of my evening clutch. I opened the encrypted application I had meticulously programmed over the past 3 weeks. Using the top-tier administrative credentials I had extracted from his secured tablet while he slept, I seamlessly bypassed the hotel audiovisual security firewall. I stared at the screen for one fraction of a second. Then, I tapped the execution command. On the main stage, the glowing corporate logo behind Julian violently flickered, distorted into static, and vanished completely. In its place, a massive, high-definition image illuminated the room. It was the digital receipt for the vintage music box, clearly displaying Chloe Sterling as the purchaser, Julian Private Black credit card as the payment method, and a chilling custom instruction note detailing the exact minor key melody of my darkest trauma. Julian paused mid-sentence, blinking blindly into the spotlight, utterly oblivious to the damning image towering behind him. A rapid wave of confused, angry murmurs rippled through the front row of investors. Before Julian could even turn around to look, the image switched. It displayed a scrolling, undeniably clear ledger of explicit, high-end hotel bookings, perfectly cross-referenced with calendar dates when Julian was supposedly attending vital board meetings. Alongside the dates were highly graphic, undeniable text messages between the chief executive officer and his secretary. Then came the final, devastating blow. The screen shifted to a hidden camera video I had quietly recovered from the Vance family Aspen Ski Lodge security server. The audio fed directly into the ballroom primary speakers, completely overpowering Julian's dead microphone. The crisp footage showed Chloe and Beatrice sitting by a roaring fireplace, viciously and happily mocking my 7-year-old son. They were cruelly imitating his mild speech impediment, laughing loudly as they called him a defective, slow-witted child who needed to be shipped off and medically fixed so he would not embarrass the family name. The grand ballroom descended into absolute, deafening chaos. Wealthy investors gasped in genuine horror, instantly reaching into their tailored tuxedo pockets to pull out their phones and frantically dial their legal teams. The flawless illusion of the honorable family man was violently, irreparably shattered into a million pieces. Julian finally turned around to look at the screen. The color drained entirely from his face as he stared at the 50-foot projection of his mistress and his sister mocking his own flesh and blood. His jaw dropped. He looked exactly like a man who had just stepped squarely onto a hidden landmine. I did not stay a single second longer to watch him scramble for an excuse. I calmly walked through the shouting crowd over to where Beatrice stood. She was frozen in sheer shock, her face deathly pale and her mouth hanging wide open as the high society women around her physically backed away in utter disgust. I looked her directly in the eyes. I slipped my flawless, 3-carat diamond wedding ring off my finger. Without uttering a single word, I held my hand over her glass and dropped the heavy ring directly into her crystal flute of champagne. The diamond hit the bottom of the glass with a sharp, final clink that she would remember for the rest of her life. I turned my back on the screaming, panicked crowd, pushed open the heavy brass and glass front doors of the hotel, and walked out into the cold, cleansing Seattle rain. By 9 o'clock the next morning, the retaliatory strike began exactly as my attorney, Eleanor Hayes, had predicted. Julian, stripped of his public dignity and operating purely on bruised ego and adrenaline, attempted a textbook scorched earth legal strategy. His goal was to sever my lifelines, to starve me out and force me back to the marital home on my knees. I sat in Eleanor's sleek downtown office, sipping hot decaffeinated tea, as the notifications rolled in. My platinum credit cards were abruptly canceled. My access to the primary joint checking and savings accounts was revoked. The digital access codes to the estate gates were changed. He was trying to suffocate me financially, assuming I was the helpless, the dependent housewife I had played so flawlessly over the past 3 weeks. What Julian did not realize was that his financial guillotine had dropped on a completely empty block. When his high-priced corporate lawyers finally audited the marital accounts that afternoon, they discovered a gaping, catastrophic void. Exactly 21 days prior, legally acting within my rights as a joint account holder in a community property state, I had quietly and methodically wire transferred exactly 50% of all our liquid assets. Millions of dollars had been smoothly routed into an ironclad private trust managed by Eleanor's firm. By the time Julian tried to freeze the accounts, the money was already gone, legally untouchable and entirely under my control. He had brought a knife to a war I had already won from the shadows. Simultaneously, Chloe Sterling decided to launch her own pathetic counteroffensive in the court of public opinion, desperate to salvage her reputation after the gala disaster. She ran straight to the local Seattle press and flooded her social media channels. She posted a tearful, highly edited video claiming she was the victim of a vicious, unprovoked smear campaign. She painted me as a deeply unstable, jealous woman suffering from a severe pregnancy-induced psychotic breakdown. She alleged the audio of her mocking my son was deepfake technology, a malicious fabrication designed by a hysterical housewife to ruin an innocent career woman. Her strategy was predictable, and it was her fatal mistake. I did not respond with emotion. I responded with irrefutable, cold data. Through Eleanor, I released a single, razor-sharp statement to the leading tech and business publications in Washington state. We did not just release the video again. We released the raw, unedited digital metadata file extracted directly from the Vance estate servers. The metadata included precise timestamps, geolocation coordinates, and device serial numbers that mathematically proved the recording was authentic and completely unaltered. But I did not stop there. I included a small, carefully redacted file of encrypted emails Chloe had sent from her corporate account. The emails proved that she had been carelessly sharing highly confidential Aegis Vanguard trade secrets with unauthorized third parties just to impress her social circle. In one calculated, legally vetted strike, I did not just expose her as a liar, I destroyed her professional credibility entirely. No reputable firm in the tech sector would ever hire an executive secretary who leaked proprietary corporate data. Chloe was instantly radioactive. The fallout was instantaneous and brutal. The board of directors at Aegis Vanguard Holdings convened an emergency, closed-door session before noon. The impending $300 million merger was suddenly bleeding investors. The scandal was no longer just a messy domestic dispute. It was a massive corporate liability. Eleanor received a panicked call from Julian's lead counsel, revealing that the board had officially threatened to oust Julian from his position as chief executive officer if he did not contain the legal bleeding within 48 hours. His empire was actively collapsing on top of him, and the board members were scrambling for the lifeboats. However, the corporate destruction was merely a pleasant side effect. My absolute primary objective had always been my son. Utilizing the undeniable high-definition footage of Julian's sister and mistress emotionally abusing Leo, Eleanor filed an emergency ex parte motion for temporary full custody. Family court judges in Washington state do not look kindly upon documented emotional abuse, especially when the child's wealthy father actively facilitates it. At exactly 4 o'clock in the afternoon, the judge granted the emergency injunction without hesitation. I did not call Julian to inform him. I simply rode in the back of a black Suburban, flanked by 2 armed Seattle police officers and a court-appointed child advocate. We pulled up to the massive iron gates of the Vance estate. The officers presented the court order to the stunned private security guards, forcing the gates open. We walked straight through the massive front doors. Julian came rushing down the grand staircase, his face flushed purple with rage, screaming threats at the officers. They calmly placed their hands on their duty belts and instructed him to step back, citing the emergency federal injunction. I did not even look at my husband. I walked past him, straight into the living room where Leo was sitting on the sofa, looking frightened and confused. I knelt down, wrapped my arms around his small shoulders, and whispered that we were going on an adventure, just the 2 of us. I took my son by the hand and walked him out of that toxic mansion, leaving Julian standing in the foyer, utterly powerless, watching his family and his legacy drive away under police escort. 2 days after I removed my son from the Vance estate, the fragile alliance between my enemies began to fracture under the crushing weight of their own arrogance. I was parked outside the private elementary school at 3 o'clock in the afternoon, waiting in the driver's seat of my newly leased, armored sport utility vehicle. The Seattle sky was overcast, casting a flat, gray light over the drop-off lane. Before the final bell could ring, a sleek black town car pulled up directly behind me. Beatrice stepped out, her posture rigid, wearing a dark trench coat that made her look like a grim shadow. She marched over to my window and tapped sharply on the glass. I lowered it just an inch, keeping the engine running and the doors locked. "We need to end this ridiculous circus right now," Beatrice hissed through the narrow opening, casting nervous glances at the other parents milling about the courtyard. "Julian is facing massive pressure from the board, and you are dragging the family name through the mud. I am authorized to offer you a singular, off-the-books payout, $5 million, wired directly to any offshore account of your choosing by tomorrow morning. In exchange, you sign a binding non-disclosure agreement, drop the custody suit, and quietly relocate out of Washington state. Without the boy, she actually believed I was still playing a game of leverage. I looked at her, noting the slight tremor in her hands and the desperate tightness around her eyes. You really should audit your brother's personal ledgers before you offer me phantom money. Beatrice, I replied, my voice perfectly level. Julian does not have $5 million to give. In fact, he is entirely insolvent. I discovered last week that over the past 18 months, he has been illegally siphoning money from his own son's generational trust fund. He drained exactly $850,000 to secure the mortgage on a luxury penthouse in the financial district for his secretary. All the color vanished from Beatrice's sharp face. The Vance family worshipped money above blood, and the realization that Julian had stolen from the Sacred Family Trust to finance his pathetic affair broke her allegiance instantly. She took a stumbling step back from the vehicle as the final school bell rang. I rolled the window up, leaving her standing alone on the cold pavement. The rot spread quickly. At exactly 9 o'clock that same evening, my burner phone buzzed. The caller identification showed an unknown number, but I recognized the frantic, shallow breathing the moment I answered. It was Chloe. "They are locking me out of the building," Chloe sobbed into the receiver. All of her previous gala bravado completely evaporated. The board of directors froze my corporate accounts, and Julian is not answering my calls. He is throwing me to the wolves to save his own position. You have to help me. I pressed a button on my secondary device, initiating a high-fidelity audio recording. "Why would I possibly help you?" I asked, allowing a trace of mild curiosity into my tone. "Because I can give you Julian," she pleaded, her voice cracking with desperation. "I will testify against him in family court. I will tell the judge everything. It was his idea to ice you out of the family. He orchestrated the entire alienation strategy. He explicitly ordered me to take that ski trip photo and send it to you to break your spirit. He said if we made you feel crazy enough, you would voluntarily leave and abandon Leo. Just grant me financial immunity from the corporate fallout, and I will be your star witness." She had just handed me the final, damning piece of the puzzle, an explicit, recorded confession of parental alienation and psychological abuse, orchestrated by the father. "I already have everything I need," I stated coldly. "Your testimony is entirely worthless to me now. You played a dangerous game for a prize you did not understand, and now you have to pay the tab. Do not ever contact me again." I terminated the call and saved the audio file to 3 separate encrypted cloud servers. Chloe was left with absolutely nothing, abandoned by the man she thought would elevate her, and destroyed by the woman she thought she could replace. The final collapse happened 48 hours later. I was standing in the lobby of my heavily secured, private high-rise apartment building, speaking with the head concierge, when a violent pounding echoed through the space. I turned to see Julian standing outside the thick, bulletproof glass doors of the lobby. He was completely unhinged. His expensive tailored suit was wrinkled and stained with rain. His hair was a chaotic mess, and his eyes were wild with the manic desperation of a cornered animal. He slammed his fists against the reinforced glass, screaming my name and demanding to see his son. The sophisticated, untouchable chief executive officer was gone, replaced by a pathetic, broken man throwing a tantrum on the sidewalk. The concierge reached for the telephone to call the Seattle police. I gently placed my hand over his to stop him. I walked slowly across the polished marble floor until I was standing mere inches from Julian, separated only by the impenetrable barrier of the glass. He shouted something incomprehensible, his breath fogging up the pain. I did not raise my voice. I did not flinch. I reached into my leather tote bag and pulled out a single sheet of heavy legal paper. It was a permanent, court-ordered restraining order, signed by a federal judge just 2 hours prior, barring Julian Vance from coming within 500 feet of myself or our son. I knelt down and slid the document through the narrow mail slot at the bottom of the glass door. Julian stopped banging. He looked down at the paper resting on the wet pavement. I stood perfectly still, watching his eyes dart across the heavy black ink of the judge's signature. I watched the fight drain entirely out of his body, as the absolute reality of his total, irreversible defeat finally washed over his face. The final divorce and custody mediation took place on the 24th floor of a glass legal tower overlooking Elliott Bay. Julian sat directly across from me at the massive mahogany conference table, flanked by a team of 4 expensive corporate defense attorneys. He had managed to find a clean suit, and his old, arrogant smirk had returned. He spent the first 10 minutes leaning back in his leather chair, checking his luxury watch, and whispering confidently to his lead counsel. He believed this was a war of attrition. He assumed that despite the public scandal, his massive wealth would allow him to drag the litigation out for years until my legal funds evaporated and I was forced to compromise on custody. Eleanor Hayes did not look intimidated. She sat perfectly still, her fountain pen resting neatly on a legal pad. When Julian-led attorney finished a lengthy, pompous opening statement about dragging the case to a full trial, Eleanor simply smiled. "We are not going to trial," Eleanor said smoothly. She reached into her briefcase and slid a single, thin manila folder across the polished wood table. It stopped precisely in front of Julian. "I suggest you read the contents before you waste any more of our time." Julian chuckled, a hollow, mocking sound, and flipped the folder open. As his eyes scanned the top document, the smug expression on his face completely died. The color drained from his cheeks, leaving him looking sickly in the fluorescent lights. "What is the meaning of this?" Julian stammered, his voice suddenly thin and reedy. "The meaning is quite simple," I said, speaking for the first time. "You built Aegis Vanguard Holdings on a lie. Julian, the core, proprietary database encryption software that your company is currently about to sell in your $300 million merger was not created by your engineering team. I authored that entire codebase 9 years ago, a full year before I ever met you, under my maiden name, Private Limited Liability Company. When we married, you integrated it into your platform, but I never signed a corporate assignment of intellectual property. I own the unassigned copyright. Every single dollar your company has made using that software for the past 7 years constitutes federal copyright infringement." Julian, lead attorney, grabbed the folder, his eyes widening in absolute horror as he reviewed the original time-stamped code repositories and the active federal copyright registrations. The corporate lawyers immediately huddled around Julian, whispering frantically in hushed, panicked tones. They knew instantly that the legal shield was gone. Eleanor leaned forward, her voice cutting through their panic like a razor. "Here is our final ultimatum. You will sign the absolute surrender of all legal and physical custody of Leo right now. You will renounce any claims to the marital assets we have secured, and you will walk away with nothing. If you do not sign these papers by the time we leave this room, I will file a federal injunction at exactly 9 o'clock tomorrow morning. The injunction will freeze your $300 million merger instantly, and the accompanying audit will expose your systematic corporate fraud to the federal prosecutors. You will not just be broke. Julian, you will be wearing a jumpsuit in a federal penitentiary." Julian looked around the room, utterly outplayed and completely broken. His own legal team silently shook their heads, signaling that there was no defense, no loophole, and no escape. With a trembling hand, Julian grabbed the silver pen. He pressed down so hard the paper tore slightly as he violently scribbled his signature across the custody settlement and the asset division papers. Beatrice Vance, who had been sitting quietly in the back corner of the room to protect the family interests, stood up immediately. She did not say a word to her brother. She turned her back on him completely and walked out of the room, slamming the heavy door behind her. Moments later, Chloe Sterling, who had arrived at the building with her own attorney hoping to demand a financial payout from Julian, was formally escorted out of the entire complex by 2 burly building security guards for trespassing. 4 months later, the dust had completely settled. The afternoon sun streamed through the expansive windows of my new, bright townhome in Queen Anne, far away from the dark, toxic shadow of the Vance Empire. The air smelled of fresh lavender and clean linen, I sat comfortably in a rocking chair in the nursery, gently holding my beautiful, healthy newborn daughter, Maya. The door pushed open quietly, and Leo walked into the room. The tense, anxious look he used to wear at his father's estate had vanished entirely. His shoulders were relaxed, and his mild speech impediment had completely disappeared with the removal of his daily stress. He walked over to the chair on tiptoe, a bright, genuine smile on his face. He reached out and gently touched his new sister's tiny hand. He looked up at me, his eyes clear and peaceful. "Mom, do we ever have to go back to my dad's house ever again?" I looked down at my two beautiful children, a deep, fierce warmth blooming in my chest. I had burned a corrupt corporate empire to the ground to keep them safe, and I would do it again in a heartbeat. I smiled at my son, kissed his forehead, and simply said, "Never." Thank you so much to all of our incredible listeners for staying with us until the very end of this dramatic journey on Violet Revenge Stories. I am truly curious to know, where are you listening to our story from today? Please let us know in the comments section below. If you found today's story powerful and captivating, please consider helping our channel with a small donation of just $1. You can easily do this by scanning the QR code of our donation page right now on your screen, or by clicking the direct donation link located in the video description and pinned comment. Your generous support allows us to pay our dedicated staff fairly so they can support their families and continue creating these thrilling, high-quality stories for you every single day. Thank you from the bottom of our hearts, and stay tuned for the next episode.